Thank you. Thank you very much. Um, First of all, I'd like to thank you for inviting me and, of course, greet everyone a fine afternoon. Um, can you hear me at the back? Because I wasn't blessed with a very loud voice. My voice strains easily, so I'll try my best to sound clearly all the way at the back. Anyway, as what was mentioned, um, I am a Vice Chair of the Committee on National Defense, so perhaps the topic that we're discussing this afternoon is very much into the work that I've been doing in Congress. And not to mention, of course, my personal exposure in the field of national defense and security, with my father being the AFP Chief of Staff, and me working with him during his time in the Senate as chairman of the Committee on Defense in the Philippine Senate. Well, earlier as our hosts were explaining the topic of this afternoon's forum, mention was made about the incident in Maguindanao. And although we are talking in general about terrorism, one form of terrorism, I would say, is the terrorism brought about by the existence of private armies. Because they do cause terror, and as we've seen in Maguindanao, journalists were even victims of the actions of private armies. So I would like to focus more on that aspect of terrorism, leaving behind the terrorism of the Al-Qaeda, Abu Sayyaf kind. Let's focus more on the political aspect of terrorism, especially during this time that we are, thank you very much, especially during this time that we're entering into the elections. Well, commonly, when we talk about private armies, we automatically think about politicians. Probably you're wondering, where is my private army? Well, I do not have a private army. Usually you will see these private or partisan armed groups, that's what they are termed technically, PAGS, partisan armed groups in the hinterlands, in the provinces. Although you do get to see them around in Metro Manila also, but generally they are more common in the provinces, where political rivalries tend to force or tend to make politicians feel that the strength is on their side if they have private armed groups. When we look at private armies in terms of legalities, there is no legal definition of the private army. Although it says in the Constitution, it recognizes private armies, Congress in the past, the legislature, has failed to come up with a legal definition. And probably that is one of the reasons why there is difficulty in addressing that problem. Article 18, Section 24 of the Constitution says that private armies and other armed groups not recognized by duly constituted authorities shall be dismantled. But then how can you dismantle them if you do not even have a legal definition? So that's a failure, what we can say a failure on the part of the legislature from 1987, from the time the Constitution was passed, up to this very day. There hasn't been any attempt to define it. Next, the Constitution itself provides a loophole. It says here, other armed groups not recognized by duly constituted authorities. So if a particular armed group is recognized by duly constituted authorities, then they're not subject to be dismantled. The Constitution itself provided that. So now if we look at the situation around the country, going in particular to the situation in Mindanao, where political rivalry led to that massacre, it would appear that this was brought about by the neglect not just of this government, but of previous governments. We allowed it to happen. We allowed the practice to proliferate until this very day. That's why it reached a point where rivalries between political clans, political factions, went to the level of armed struggle amongst each other. The political reality on the ground is that those who are in power are usually the ones recognized by the duly constituted authority. So in the case of Maguindanao, the Ampatuans were the ones in power, and the duly constituted authority, which is this administration, this government, recognized the existence of their armed groups, giving it the justification that these armed groups are used as a force multiplier against insurgency and other peace and order problems in that part of the country. So if you look at it, under the legal framework, everything was quote-unquote legal. Because the head of the private armed group is an elected government official, the governor of ARMM and the governor of Maguindanao, and the duly authorized entity which recognizes them is the Republic of the Philippines, headed by the President of the Philippines. And the issuance of certain presidential issuances gave life to the existence of those private armed groups. Let me just get my reference here. Executive Order 546 mandated the PNP to take an active support role to the AFP in the suppression of insurgency. That was the first step. We are looking at the aspect of civilian volunteer organizations, CVOs, because the armed groups there involved in the Maguindanao massacre were CVOs. So the first step was the issuance of the Executive Order 546, mandating the PNP. Therefore, the PNP issued several issuances, among which is the NAPOLCOM Memorandum Circular number 2008-013, prescribing guidelines and procedures governing the deputation of barangay tanods as members of police auxiliary units. Those were just beginning steps of legalizing the arming of these civilian volunteer organizations. The justification is that they would be force multipliers to the PNP in the fight against insurgency. Other issuances were Letter of Instruction 0209 or Mapagpalaya, which defines the creation of Barangay Peacekeeping Action Teams or BPATs as the main operators of barangay peacekeeping. Another issuance was Letter of Instructions 4008 entitled Damayan, and it's the guidelines referring to the activation of police auxiliary units. And finally, the DILG Memorandum Circular 2009-145, directing the LGUs to support the PPATs and the PAUs. So based on these government guidelines and issuances, government itself laid the groundwork for the existence of those private armies. It provided the basis, it provided the justification, and it provided the environment for them to flourish. In effect, the Ampatuans were given the mandate to maintain this armed group on the pretext that they will be used as force multipliers. But you know, realities on the ground, in politics, rivalries exist. In fact, about 4 months before the Maguindanao massacre, the government was already warned